The crystal flute, a delicate, almost ethereal thing, felt unnaturally cold in Amelia's hand, a stark counterpoint to the thrumming anxiety that had been her unwelcome, persistent companion all afternoon. Champagne, the color of pale, insipid gold, sloshed with the almost imperceptible tremor of her fingers, its effervescence a mocking imitation of joy. Around her, the grand reception hall of the old, almost sepulchral Blackwood Manor buzzed with a forced, glittering energy, a desperate pantomime of celebration. It was a suffocating symphony of rustling silk, the discreetly expensive, cloying perfumes of the city's elite, the low, insincere murmur of polite, if often utterly vapid conversation, and the saccharine, almost painful, strains of a string quartet sawing away with a valiant, if ultimately futile, effort in a far, gilded alcove. Clara, her cousin, the ostensible reason for this opulent, emotionally hollow charade, was radiant, or at least, she performed radiance with the practiced, almost brittle grace of someone long accustomed to the crushing weight of familial and societal expectation. Her gown, a cloud of antique lace and meticulously sewn seed pearls, was undoubtedly an heirloom, a relic from a more innocent, or perhaps just more skillfully deceptive era. Her smile, however, seemed less ancestral, more recently and perhaps hastily, acquired, a little too bright, a little too fixed, like a sheet of flawless, treacherous ice on the verge of a catastrophic cracking. Julian Thorne, the groom, a man whose soul, Amelia suspected, was as impeccably tailored and utterly devoid of warmth as his bespoke suit, stood beside her, a study in chilling self-possession and reptilian charm. His dark hair, a sculpted, unyielding helmet, was impeccably styled, his smile a precisely calibrated, utterly soulless instrument of social weaponry that never, not once, managed to reach the Arctic, calculating blue of his eyes. He was, Amelia was forced to concede, handsome in a way that was both undeniable and deeply unsettling, like a perfectly rendered portrait of a predator. He collected beautiful, expensive things, art, companies, alliances, women, with an air of casual, entitled acquisition, as if the world itself were merely a showroom for his desires. Thorne Textiles, a name whispered with a mixture of grudging awe and seething resentment in the city's financial districts, was his birthright, a testament to generations of ruthless ambition, and Clara, sweet, trusting, tragically naive Clara, was his latest, most prized, and perhaps most fragile, possession. Amelia took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne. It tasted flat, almost metallic, mirroring the acrid undercurrent of profound unease that had been coiling, snake-like, in the pit of her stomach since they'd first stepped out of the chauffeured car and into the imposing, shadowed entrance of Blackwood Manor. It wasn't just Julian, with his predatory grace and his eyes like chips of glacial ice, or the almost feudal, disdainful air of his parents, the elder Thornes, who surveyed the assembled guests from their self-appointed throne-like chairs near the grotesquely ornate head table, as if inspecting a particularly unpromising crop of serfs. It was something else, something less tangible, more insidious, a subtle, jarring dissonance in the city's familiar, comforting hum that she'd noticed earlier, a discordant note in the urban symphony that had set her teeth on edge. A distant siren, its mournful wail abruptly, unnaturally, choked off mid-cry. A strange, unsettling flicker in the streetlights as they'd navigated the usually vibrant, now strangely subdued evening streets. The way a normally bustling, cacophonous intersection, usually a snarl of impatient taxis and jaywalking pedestrians, had been eerily, unnaturally, almost supernaturally, quiet. Wedding day nerves, she'd tried to tell herself, a common affliction, but the feeling lingered. A cold, persistent, unwelcome whisper at the very edge of her perception, a premonition of something vast and terrible stirring in the city's shadowed underbelly. She caught the eye of her brother, Thomas, across the crowded, suffocating room. He was leaning, with his usual air of weary, cynical detachment, against a cold, indifferent marble pillar, his own champagne flute untouched, his expression a familiar, almost comforting blend of wry amusement and quiet, simmering disdain for this particular brand of high society farce. He met her gaze and gave a fractional, almost imperceptible lift of an eyebrow, a silent, shared acknowledgement of the oppressive, cloying atmosphere, of the unspoken, uncomfortable truths that lurked beneath the glittering, brittle surface of this supposed celebration. Thomas, unlike Amelia, had never made a secret of his profound, visceral dislike for Julian Thorne, a sentiment Amelia wholeheartedly, if always more discreetly, shared. The string quartet, with a final sighing flourish, segued into another cloyingly romantic, utterly forgettable piece. Julian Thorne, his hand a possessive, almost bruising brand on the delicate, vulnerable small of Clara's back, was leading her, with an air of proprietorial triumph, towards the polished, unforgiving expanse of the dance floor. The guests, a glittering, murmuring sea of expensive silks, rich velvets, and meticulously arranged, utterly false smiles, parted obligingly, their movements practiced, almost ritualistic. This was the moment, the carefully curated, ruthlessly enforced spectacle of marital bliss, the public affirmation of a union that felt to Amelia more like a corporate merger than a joining of hearts. Amelia watched them, a strange, cold premonition tightening its icy grip around her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Clara's steps, she noticed, seemed hesitant, almost reluctant, her smile faltering for a split, revealing second before being quickly, desperately reassembled, a mask of fragile, unconvincing joy. Julian, however, moved with a confident, almost predatory grace, his cold eyes sweeping over the room, a newly crowned king surveying his conquered, if somewhat underwhelming, domain. Then, the first, truly jarring, undeniably discordant note in their carefully orchestrated, relentlessly enforced symphony of manufactured celebration. A sound from outside the manor's thick, insulating stone walls. Not the usual urban clamor, the comforting, familiar white noise of the city. Not the distant, reassuring rumble of traffic, or the playful shouts of children in a nearby park. A scream. Raw, ragged, high-pitched, and undeniably, terrifyingly human. It sliced through the polite, suffocating murmur of the reception hall like a shard of jagged, razor-sharp glass. The music, for a single heart-stopping beat, faltered, a violin string screeching in discordant protest before the musicians, professionals to their very core, their faces impassive masks, quickly, almost desperately, recovered their composure, their bows resuming their relentless saccharine sawing. But the spell, the fragile, carefully constructed illusion of normalcy, of celebration, was irrevocably, brutally broken. A ripple of uneasy, questioning glances, of suddenly hushed, anxious murmurs, spread like a contagion through the assembled, elegantly dressed guests. Julian Thorne's meticulously crafted smile, for the first time that long, oppressive evening, flickered, faltered, threatened to collapse. His eyes, those cold, calculating, soulless orbs, darted, with a sudden, almost furtive urgency, towards the grand, arched windows that overlooked the manor's impeccably manicured front lawns and the usually bustling, now strangely silent city street beyond. "Probably just some overzealous revelers," he announced, his voice a fraction too loud, a touch too dismissive, betraying the sudden, unwelcome crack in his icy composure. "The city always has its colorful, if somewhat boisterous elements." But no one was listening. No one was convinced. The air in the hall, moments ago thick with forced gaiety and the cloying scent of wilting roses, had gone still, cold, charged with a sudden, prickling, almost unbearable tension. Another scream, closer this time, more desperate, more ragged, more terrifying, followed by a sickening, wet, tearing sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards, through the soles of Amelia's suddenly cold, trembling feet, through the very marrow of her bones. Amelia felt the delicate crystal champagne flute slip, as if in slow motion, from her suddenly numb, unresponsive fingers, shattering on the polished, unforgiving parquet with a sharp, explosive, almost deafening crack that seemed to echo the violent, irrevocable fracturing of their carefully constructed, utterly illusory reality. Thomas was already moving, his lean, athletic frame cutting with a sudden, surprising urgency through the suddenly paralyzed, staring guests, his usually cynical, world-weary face now a mask of grim, focused concern. He reached the tall, arched windows first, Amelia a hesitant, fearful step behind, her heart hammering against her ribs like a frantic, trapped bird, its desperate wings beating against the bars of its cage. The scene outside, framed by the ornate grime-streaked leaded glass, was a tableau from a fever dream. A Hieronymus Bosch painting rendered in screaming, visceral, terrifyingly real flesh and blood. The elegant, tree-lined street, moments ago a picture of autumnal tranquility, of urban sophistication, was now a stage for unimaginable, unmitigated, unrelenting horror. Figures lurching, stumbling, their movements jerky, uncoordinated, almost spastic, their limbs flailing at unnatural, impossible angles, were attacking pedestrians, passers-by, anyone still caught in the open, with a savage, animalistic, utterly mindless fury. A woman in a smart, expensive-looking business suit, her face a mask of dawning, incredulous terror, was pulled down, her designer briefcase skittering. With a strange, almost comical incongruity, across the pristine, blood-spattered pavement, her high-pitched, desperate screams abruptly, sickeningly, silenced as two of the grotesque, lurching figures descended upon her, tearing at her with a horrifying, single-minded, almost ritualistic intensity. A sleek, black delivery van, its side emblazoned with the cheerful, innocuous logo of a high-end organic bakery, swerved erratically, its tires screeching, then crashed, with a deafening metallic shriek, into an ornate cast-iron lamppost, its horn, jammed by the impact, blaring a continuous, mournful, almost funereal note into the suddenly still, terrified air. "What in God's name?" Thomas whispered, his voice a dry, incredulous rasp, his knuckles white, almost translucent, where he gripped the ornate antique window frame, as if to steady himself against the sudden, violent lurching of his own stomach, against the sudden, terrifying tilting of his entire world. Amelia felt a wave of acrid, burning bile rise in her throat, the taste of fear, bitter and metallic, flooding her mouth. These weren't just attackers. These weren't rioters. These weren't gang members engaged in some brutal, territorial dispute. There was something profoundly, terrifyingly, fundamentally wrong with them. Their eyes, visible even from this horrifying, unwelcome distance, were milky, vacant, devoid of reason, of recognition, of any lingering spark of humanity. Their mouths were contorted into bloodied, grotesque snarls, their expensive, fashionable clothes torn, ripped, stained with viscous, dark patches of what could only be blood. Their skin, where it was visible, was an unhealthy, mottled, almost translucent gray. They moved with a horrifying, twitching, unnatural energy, a relentless, unthinking, insatiable aggression, like puppets animated by some unseen, malevolent, demonic force. The outbreak. The word, unspoken, unbidden, screamed in the sudden roaring silence of Amelia's mind. The whispers, the quickly dismissed, vaguely sensationalist fringe news reports from obscure corners of the internet, the condescendingly ignored online rumors of a fast-spreading, unusually aggressive, neurologically degenerative pathogen in distant, unimportant, easily forgotten countries. It was here, now, not a distant, abstract, easily ignorable threat, but a visceral, unfolding, unstoppable nightmare right outside their gilded, fragile, utterly inadequate cage. Panic, a raw, primal, contagious thing, erupted in the reception hall, a sudden explosive release of pent-up fear and dawning, horrified understanding. Shouts, cries, the frantic, discordant, almost hysterical scrape of chairs as the elegantly dressed, moments ago complacent guests, their faces now masks of disbelief and rapidly escalating terror, scrambled, their carefully constructed social hierarchies, their practiced civility, their ingrained deference to wealth and status, dissolving in an instant, stripped away to reveal the raw, terrified, stampeding animal beneath. The grand, imposing oak doors at the main entrance, their only viable, if now utterly compromised, escape route to the waiting liveried chauffeurs, the gleaming, silent limousines, and a world that Amelia knew with a sudden, chilling certainty no longer existed, began to rattle, to shake, to groan. Violently, under the relentless, percussive, almost rhythmic assault from something heavy, something desperate, something inhuman, on the other side. Thick, ancient wood splintered, cracked, the sound like gunshots in the sudden terrified hush. Julian Thorne, who had stood frozen, a statue of crumbling arrogance for a beat, his carefully cultivated lifelong composure shattering like Amelia's carelessly dropped champagne flute, seemed to visibly, almost physically, pull himself together, the shock in his eyes replaced by a strange, cold, almost reptilian light, a flicker of something that looked chillingly, terrifyingly, like calculation amidst the encroaching, overwhelming terror. He barked orders, his voice sharp, brittle, edged with a new, unfamiliar, steely authority, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to impose order on a world that was rapidly, violently, descending into pure, unadulterated, mindless chaos. Barricade the windows. Now. Use the curtains, tablecloths, anything. Move. He gestured with a wide, frantic sweep of his arm towards the heavy, oppressive velvet drapes that framed the now silent, deserted stage. The doors. Get those tables, the chairs, anything with weight. Block the main entrance. Hurry, damn you, hurry. Some of the catering staff, their professional deference, their ingrained servitude, momentarily overriding their paralyzing fear, began to move, their actions clumsy, uncoordinated, almost comically inept. Julian's groomsmen, a tight, pale, terrified knot of privileged, pampered young men, their bespoke suits suddenly looking like absurd, irrelevant costumes, looked to him, their usual arrogant swagger gone, replaced by a desperate, almost childlike need for direction, for reassurance, for someone, anyone, to tell them what to do in this sudden, inexplicable, terrifying unraveling of their ordered, predictable, utterly coddled world. Clara, the bride, the tragic, beautiful, innocent centerpiece of this disastrous, blood-soaked charade, was a crumpled, sobbing heap of white lace and silent, racking, body-shuddering terror in a far, shadowed corner. Her mother, a woman whose face was a mask of equally profound, if more controlled, despair, and a few equally distraught, mascara-streaked bridesmaids attempting to offer comfort that was as fragile, as useless, as their own wilting, expensive corsages. Her fairy tale, her carefully planned, meticulously executed, socially advantageous dream wedding, had ended, not with a romantic, blissful, happily ever after, but with a brutal, violent, terrifying descent into a blood-soaked, screaming, seemingly inescapable hell. Amelia felt a strange, almost unnatural, cold detachment settle over her, a necessary, almost surgical armor against the overwhelming, paralyzing fear, against the rising tide of nausea and despair. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford, a weakness that would be swiftly, brutally exploited by the horrors both outside and, she increasingly suspected, within these suddenly claustrophobic, opulently appointed walls. Survival, she knew with a sudden, chilling clarity, demanded a brutal, unthinking, almost inhuman efficiency. She grabbed Thomas's arm, her grip surprisingly strong, her eyes, when they met his, clear, focused, almost unnervingly calm. "The kitchens," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, cutting through the ambient, rising hysteria. "There has to be a back way out, a delivery entrance, a service stairwell, something." They pushed, they shoved, they fought their way through the panicked, milling, directionless guests, their progress agonizingly, frustratingly, dangerously slow. The air in the hall was thick, almost unbreathable, with the stench of fear, an acrid, cloying, almost acidic miasma that mixed, in a grotesque funereal parody, with the fading scent of wilting roses and spilled, expensive champagne. The kitchen, when they finally desperately reached it, was a scene of more contained, more shivering, more pathetic chaos. The catering staff, their pristine white uniforms now stained with sweat, grime, and the unmistakable spreading patches of pure, undiluted terror, huddled, a trembling, white-clad mass near the gleaming, indifferent steel countertops, their eyes wide, dark, darting, animal-like. A young busboy, no older than 16, his face a pale greenish-white, was retching, violently, uncontrollably, into a large stainless steel sink, his thin, boyish shoulders shaking with each ragged, body-racking heave. Amelia ignored them, her gaze, sharp, focused, desperate, sweeping over the functional, utilitarian, suddenly promising space. A heavy, reinforced steel service door, its surface scarred, dented, streaked with old, forgotten grease stains, was bolted, securely, ominously, from the inside. A small, grimy, wire mesh reinforced window, set too high in the soot-stained brick wall to offer a viable, or even remotely practical escape route, overlooked a dark, narrow, refuse-strewn, undoubtedly monster-infested alleyway. And in one shadowed, forgotten corner, the closed, anachronistic, almost mocking, dark wooden doors of a dumbwaiter shaft, a relic from a more genteel, less terrifying era. Thomas, his face a mask of grim, sweat-soaked determination, was already at the heavy steel service door, his hands surprisingly steady, fumbling with the thick, rusted, unyielding bolts. They were stiff, resistant, frozen by years of disuse and neglect. He grunted with effort, his breath coming in harsh, ragged, audible gasps, his face flushed a dark, unhealthy crimson, veins standing out, thick and corded, on his neck and temples. Finally, with a tortured, protesting groan of overstressed, unwilling metal, the first impossibly stubborn bolt slid back. The sound in the sudden ringing silence of the kitchen, almost deafening. He wrestled, with a renewed, desperate energy, with the second his knuckles. Amelia noticed with a strange, detached clarity, scraped raw, bleeding. Amelia watched, her heart pounding a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs. Her own makeshift, pathetically inadequate weapon, a wickedly sharp, surprisingly well-balanced silver carving knife she'd snatched, with a strange, almost dreamlike calmness from a deserted, overturned buffet table in the main hall held tight, its ornate handle digging painfully into her trembling, sweating palm. The second bolt, with a sudden, jarring, explosive crack, gave way. Thomas, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of triumph and trepidation, pulled the heavy steel door open a fraction of an inch, peering out, with extreme, almost painful caution, into the deepening, ominous gloom of the narrow, refuse-choked alleyway. Amelia held her breath, her ears straining, her senses stretched to their absolute, almost breaking limit, trying to hear, to see, to sense, anything, any sign of movement, any hint of danger, beyond the narrow, inviting yet terrifying opening. A low, guttural, chillingly close snarl, followed almost immediately by the unmistakable shuffling, dragging scrape of heavy, clumsy, inhuman feet on broken, uneven pavement. Thomas slammed the door shut, his face a mask of pale, sickened, almost greenish dread, ramming the heavy, protesting bolts back into place with a desperate, frantic, almost convulsive energy. "Two of them," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a dry, cracking rasp above the renewed, more furious, more insistent, more terrifying, pounding at the main doors of the distant, now surely overrun reception hall. Right outside, waiting, watching, trapped. Every exit, a death trap. Every potential escape route, a new, more horrifying avenue of death. The grand, opulent, imposing Blackwood Manor, the carefully chosen, socially advantageous, ridiculously expensive venue for Clara's dream wedding, her ascent into the rarefied, icy stratosphere of the Thorne dynasty, had become their beautifully appointed, inescapable, blood-soaked tomb. The fragile, carefully constructed, lifelong illusion of safety, of a world governed by order, by civility, by the comforting, predictable rules of wealth and privilege, had been irrevocably, brutally, terrifyingly shattered, leaving behind only the jagged, razor-sharp, unforgiving shards of a new, horrific, unimaginable reality. A new sound, sharper, more distinct, more final, more terrifying than any that had come before, cut through the cacophony, through the screams, through the snarls, through the pounding, from the main hall. The unmistakable, explosive, catastrophic shattering of thick, ornate, irreplaceable leaded glass, followed, almost immediately, by a fresh, higher-pitched, more desperate, more agonized wave of screams, screams of pure, unadulterated, unmitigated, soul-shattering terror. The windows. The tall, arched, beautiful, utterly inadequate windows, their supposed shield against the harsh realities of the outside world, had been breached. They were coming in. From all sides now. The descent was accelerating, a dizzying, nauseating, unstoppable plunge, pulling them down, down, down into an abyss where the only currency was survival, the only language, screams, the only law, the brutal, unforgiving, merciless law of the jungle, and the only certainty, it seemed, with a cold, hollowing, soul-crushing finality, was a violent, terrifying, utterly meaningless end. The world Amelia had known, the world of polite, meaningless society, of expensive, tasteless champagne flutes and mind-numbing string quartets, of carefully constructed illusions and skillfully maintained facades, had died in a single, brutal, blood-soaked, unforgiving instant. This new world, this charnel house of unimaginable, unrelenting horrors, was all that remained, and it was hungry, insatiably, terrifyingly, apocalyptically, hungry. The sounds from the main hall were a symphony of the damned, a chaotic orchestra of tearing flesh, splintering wood, and the high, thin screams of the dying. Amelia pressed her back against the cold, unyielding steel of the service door, the carving knife a slick, inadequate thing in her sweating palm. Thomas stood beside her, his chest heaving, the meat cleaver held in a white-knuckled grip, his eyes darting between the flimsy latch of the kitchen door, leading back to the reception hall, and the grimy, too-high window that offered a mocking glimpse of the alleyway where at least 2 of the infected lurked. "We can't stay here," Amelia whispered, her voice a ragged edge of sound. "They'll break through that kitchen door eventually." The flimsy wooden door, designed to muffle the clatter of crockery, not withstand a siege, was already vibrating with the impacts from the other side. Thomas nodded, his jaw tight. "The dumbwaiter, it's a long shot, might be a dead end. Or worse." He looked at the small, dark wooden doors of the shaft, an anachronism even in this old manor. It was designed for hauling trays of food, not desperate survivors. But it was potentially a vertical escape route, a way to access other floors, other, perhaps less compromised, parts of the sprawling building. "It's the only option we haven't tried," Amelia agreed, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The thought of entrusting their lives to that narrow, dark, potentially trap-filled shaft was terrifying. But the alternative, to be cornered in this kitchen, to be torn apart by the things now rampaging through the manor, was infinitely worse. They moved towards the dumbwaiter, their footsteps loud on the tiled kitchen floor. Thomas wrestled with the small, tarnished brass handle. It was stiff, unyielding. He put his shoulder to it, grunting with effort. Amelia added her weight, her fear a desperate fuel. With a groan of protesting wood and a screech of reluctant metal, the doors creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow, cobweb-choked shaft, the thick, frayed ropes of the lifting mechanism disappearing into the oppressive blackness above and below. It smelled of dust, mildew, and something else, something faint, sweetish, almost rotten. "Can it even hold our weight?" Amelia breathed, peering into the Stygian gloom. "Only one way to find out," Thomas said, his voice a grim, humorless rasp. He tested the wooden platform of the dumbwaiter itself, a small, rickety square barely large enough for one person to stand comfortably, let alone 2. It creaked ominously, but seemed, for the moment, to hold. "You first. I'll try to wedge something against these doors." Amelia hesitated, her gaze fixed on the oppressive darkness of the shaft. This felt like stepping willingly into a coffin, but the sounds from the main hall, the relentless, savage chorus of the infected, were drawing closer, a terrifying, undeniable goad. She took a deep, shuddering breath, clutched her carving knife, and stepped onto the precarious platform. It swayed, creaked, but held. Thomas, meanwhile, was frantically dragging a heavy steel prep table across the kitchen floor, wedging it against the dumbwaiter doors, a pathetically inadequate barricade against the inevitable. "The ropes," he said, his voice tight with urgency, pointing to the thick, greasy hempen cables that ran up the side of the shaft. "Pull, upwards." He stepped onto the platform beside her, the small space suddenly, terrifyingly claustrophobic. The platform groaned, dipped, then settled, a fragile, suspended island in a sea of encroaching darkness. Together, their movements clumsy, uncoordinated, desperate, they began to haul on the ropes. The mechanism was stiff, resistant, designed for lighter loads, for trays of canapes and flutes of champagne, not the combined weight of 2 terrified, adrenaline-fueled adults. But it moved. Inch by agonizing inch, they ascended into the suffocating blackness, the sounds of the kitchen, of the reception hall, of the dying world above, slowly, blessedly, receding below. The air in the shaft was thick, stale, almost unbreathable. Amelia's arms burned, her muscles screamed in protest. Her hands, raw and blistered, slipped on the greasy, unyielding ropes. Thomas beside her grunted with effort, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. They climbed in a blind, desperate rhythm, their only guide the feel of the ropes in their hands, Their only hope the equally blind, desperate assumption that there was somewhere, anywhere, to go but down. After an eternity of muscle-shredding, lung-burning effort, their upward progress was halted by a sudden jarring thud. They had reached another level, or, at least, the dumbwaiter had. Fumbling in the oppressive darkness, Thomas found another set of small wooden doors. He wrestled with the latch, his breath a ragged, desperate counterpoint to Amelia's own frantic, shallow gasps. The latch gave way. He pushed the doors open, revealing not a corridor, not a room, but another, equally narrow, equally dark service stairwell. This one leading, presumably, further up into the manor's shadowed, unexplored upper reaches. They stumbled out of the dumbwaiter shaft, their legs weak, trembling, their bodies slick with sweat and grime. The air here was marginally better, less stale, less suffocating, but still tinged with the faint, unsettling scent of dust, decay, and that same, faint, sweetish, almost rotten odor they had noticed below. They were, Amelia realized with a fresh surge of despair, still trapped, still lost, still hunted, in this labyrinthine, indifferent house of horrors. But they were, for the moment, alive, and on a different floor. A small, insignificant, almost pathetic victory. But in this new, brutal, unforgiving world, any victory, no matter how small, no matter how fleeting, was a victory nonetheless. They chose a direction at random, up a narrow, winding flight of service stairs, their only guide the faint, ghostly light that filtered through a series of grime-caked, transomed windows set high in the corridor walls. The stairs opened onto a long, deserted hallway, lined with closed, imposing, dark wooden doors. Guest rooms, Amelia presumed, or perhaps the private quarters of the Thorne family themselves. The silence here was different, heavier, more oppressive than the chaotic, screaming silence of the reception hall, or the damp, dripping silence of the cellar. This was the silence of abandonment, of lives interrupted, of secrets hidden behind closed, indifferent doors. Each door they passed was a new, unspoken, terrifying question. What lay behind it? Safety? Or some new, unimaginable horror? They didn't dare to find out. Their only goal was to find a way out, a window, a fire escape, any route that led away from this cursed, blood-soaked, opulent tomb. They reached the end of the corridor, a large, ornate set of double doors, grander, more imposing than any they had yet encountered. The Thorne family's private suite, Amelia guessed, or perhaps the entrance to some forgotten, dust-filled ballroom. Thomas pushed one of the doors open a crack, peering cautiously inside. He tensed, his hand tightening on his cleaver. Amelia held her breath, her heart pounding. "Julian," Thomas whispered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "And Clara. They're in there, and they're not alone." He pushed the door open further, revealing a vast, opulently appointed drawing room, its massive, mullioned windows overlooking the now dark, silent, ruined city. Julian Thorne stood near one of the windows, his back to them, staring out at the desolation. Clara, the bride, was huddled on a nearby velvet chaise longue, her white lace gown now torn, stained, a grotesque parody of bridal purity, her face a mask of pale, vacant, unseeing terror. And with them, in the room, standing near the ornate marble fireplace, their forms silhouetted against the flickering, dying embers, were two other figures. Not infected, not guests. Something else. Dressed in dark, utilitarian, almost military-style clothing, their faces hidden in shadow, their stances alert, watchful, dangerous. And they were armed. Not with knives or cleavers or makeshift clubs, but with sleek, black, brutally efficient-looking automatic rifles. Amelia's blood ran cold. This wasn't just an outbreak. This wasn't just a random, mindless descent into chaos. This was something else. Something organized. Something planned. Something perhaps even more terrifying than the mindless, ravenous hunger of the infected. Julian Thorne, it seemed, had not just locked the doors to keep the horrors out. He had perhaps locked them in to keep something or someone else safe, or to ensure that his own dark, terrible secrets remained buried in the bloody, chaotic ruins of Blackwood Manor. The descent, Amelia realized with a fresh, chilling surge of despair, had just acquired a new, more insidious, more calculating, more human, and therefore, perhaps, more terrifying dimension. The game had changed, and the stakes, if it were even possible, had just been raised to an unbearable, unimaginable new level of life-or-death, soul-shattering intensity. The air in the opulent drawing room was thick with unspoken threats, a suffocating miasma of fear, suspicion, and a chilling, almost palpable, menace. Julian Thorne, still staring out at the ruined city, his back a rigid, unyielding line of bespoke tailoring, seemed oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to their presence. Clara, a broken doll on the velvet chaise longue, remained lost in her own private, catatonic hell. It was the two armed figures near the fireplace who held Amelia and Thomas's terrified, unwavering attention. They moved with a quiet, disciplined efficiency, their sleek black rifles held with a practiced, almost casual ease that spoke of training, of experience, of a familiarity with violence that was far beyond anything Amelia or Thomas could comprehend. One of them, a woman with short, dark, ruthlessly cropped hair and eyes that were as cold and hard as polished obsidian, took a step forward, her rifle held low, but ready. Her voice, when she spoke, was flat, devoid of inflection, almost bored. Unexpected company. Julian, you seem to have acquired stragglers. Julian Thorne finally turned, his face a mask of icy, aristocratic disdain. His eyes, those unsettling, calculating chips of Arctic blue, flickered over Amelia and Thomas, dismissing them, it seemed, as insignificant, irrelevant debris washed up by the tide of chaos. "Loose ends," he said, his voice a low, contemptuous drawl. "Nothing more, they were part of the wedding party." He waved a dismissive hand. "Deal with them, quietly. Deal with them." The words, so casually, so callously uttered, hung in the air, a death sentence delivered with the same indifferent, almost bored, an air with which one might order an unwanted dish removed from a table. Amelia felt a surge of cold, defiant rage. They had fought, they had bled, they had clawed their way through a hellscape of unimaginable horrors, only to be dismissed, to be disposed of, like inconvenient, unsightly refuse. Thomas moved first, his reaction pure, unthinking instinct. He lunged, not at the armed figures, a suicidal, futile gesture, but at Julian Thorne himself, his meat cleaver a glinting, desperate arc of silver in the dim, flickering light of the dying embers in the fireplace. "You son of a bitch," he roared, his voice a raw, ragged sound of pure, unadulterated fury. The reaction from the armed figures was instantaneous, brutally efficient. The woman with the obsidian eyes didn't even flinch. Her rifle came up, a blur of black, purposeful motion. A short, sharp, almost clinical burst of gunfire. Not a wild, panicked spray. 3 precise, controlled shots. Thomas stumbled, his forward momentum carrying him a few more desperate, lurching steps, his eyes wide with a mixture of surprise, agony, and a dawning, horrified understanding. He looked down at his chest, at the 3 dark, rapidly blossoming stains on his once pristine white shirt. He looked up at Amelia, his mouth opening as if to speak, but only a choked, gurgling sound escaped his lips. Then his legs buckled, and he crumpled to the ornate, priceless Persian rug, a broken, discarded toy. Amelia screamed, a raw, ragged, soul-tearing sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She just reacted. She launched herself not at Julian, not at the armed woman, but at the other armed figure, a man, his face a mask of cold, professional indifference, who was already bringing his own rifle to bear. Her carving knife, that small, inadequate, almost pathetic symbol of her desperate, futile resistance, was a blur of motion in her hand. She didn't even know if she hit him. She just felt a searing, blinding pain in her side, a force like a physical blow that threw her, spinning, to the floor. Darkness. A roaring, all-consuming darkness. Then, nothing. When Amelia drifted back to consciousness, it was to a world of pain, of confusion, of a throbbing, relentless ache in her side, and a dull, heavy, almost unbearable weight in her heart. She was lying on something soft, a bed, its sheets cool, almost silken against her fevered skin. The room was dim, lit by the faint, ghostly light of a single flickering candle. She tried to move, to sit up, but a fresh wave of searing pain in her side forced her back down with a choked, involuntary gasp. Easy now. A voice calm, gentle, almost kind. Not Julian, not the armed woman, someone else. She forced her heavy eyelids open, her vision swimming, unfocused. A figure coalesced out of the gloom, a woman, older, her face lined with weariness, with sorrow, but her eyes, when they met Amelia's, held a spark of something that looked almost like compassion. You're safe, for now. Safe. The word felt alien, a forgotten relic from a lost, irretrievable world. Thomas? Amelia whispered, her voice a dry, cracking, almost inaudible rasp. My brother. Is he? The woman's eyes, those kind, weary, compassionate eyes, filled with a profound, unspoken sadness. She didn't need to say the words. Amelia knew. Thomas was gone. Another casualty. Another victim. Another ghost to haunt the shadowed, blood-soaked corridors of her fractured, traumatized mind. A sob, raw, ragged, uncontrollable, tore its way from Amelia's throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated, soul-shattering grief. The woman gently, almost tenderly, stroked Amelia's forehead, her touch a small, unexpected island of comfort in an ocean of unbearable, overwhelming pain. Rest now, she whispered. You need to heal. You need to gather your strength. There will be time for grieving later. There will be time for other things, too. Other things. Revenge, perhaps. Or just survival. Amelia didn't know. She didn't care. All she felt was the cold, hollowing emptiness of loss, the crushing weight of despair, the bitter, metallic taste of a world that had, in a few short, brutal, unforgiving days, descended into an unmitigated, unyielding, seemingly endless, and utterly, terrifyingly, inescapable hell. The descent, she knew, with a cold, chilling, absolute certainty, was still far from over. It was perhaps only just beginning to reveal its true, terrifying, soul-destroying depths. Subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you so much for watching.